Okay, got it. We certainly want to thank Val. It sounds, Val, it sounds like what you're doing is a lot of fun, really interesting. Getting into the actual casting and creation, you're taking that step, which some of our members have in the past, Jim, and we remember Anderson and all the people who have done fantastic work with casting type. So we're really interested in hearing your what made you seek out Jim and what got you into it and how it went and what you'd still like to do.
Well, I used to print business cards as a moonlight thing back in the 60s, I guess.
Whoa.
And I got tired of buying type by the font, and then it was cheap. But I was a cheapskate, so I said there's a better way to do this, and that's where I got into buying a Thompson. Thanks to Stan Nelson. I worked with Stan Nelson at the Smithsonian. I was a volunteer, and he found two Thompsons in Baltimore, and that's how it all started. But then a Thompson wasn't enough, of course, so I went to the 1984 ATF. I joined ATF late because I never even heard of it until much later, like 1980s. I joined them and found out in one of our meetings in Indianapolis that there was a chap in Cincinnati who had everything I wanted. Just come and get it for a small price. That guy's name was Dorsa. He was a bookbinder, and he had a house full of machine. No, he had the machines in a warehouse, and his living room was full of matrices. So we took a 24-foot rental truck, a friend of mine, and we went to Cincinnati, 500 miles, and loaded up. And well, the rest is history. I mean, fixed up the broken machines and got them working. I built a shed, 24-foot shed, which it's documented in various ATF newsletter, etc. And in fact, in the recent newsletter, there's a little note that it was turned into an Airbnb. And it's very luxurious and beautiful inside now, where my machines used to be. And seriously, if you're going to Washington, you might try staying there. It's fairly cheap, somewhere, $100-something a night. And it's called Urban Cottage MD. And it's beautifully appointed. Has in the summer has a deck and a sauna in the winter and the whole works. So anyhow, I kind of drifted there. But
tell them about your new studio.
But then I moved up to Massachusetts, which I still can't spell. But built a, oh boy, I don't even know the size. It's like a 3-car garage in size and it happened to have 10-foot ceiling. It's a technicality. I got a nice high ceiling to let the smoke go up. And Val can vouch for it. It's a real fun place, full of equipment, 3 casters, C&P press, Vandercook, lots of books, lots of paper, lots of ink, everything. So. And
yeah, so I've got some photos. Jim, I'm going to break in.
She's going to, okay, break in. And let's turn it over to Val, though, because she's the reason really got me spirited and working again, seriously. I've had some health issues, but they're kind of behind me. And And Val's got things stirred up here, and it really was wonderful to get her up here. So let's turn it over to her.
And before we do that, just let me jump in real quick, Jim. And because some of course, many of us know you very well. And but I just wanted to let the people who might be new to this meeting know that Jim Walczak was a former member of our chapter, and for a long time, right, Jim? And as he said, lived in the area and then has moved since to Massachusetts. So
yeah. So I have a little bit of that, and we can always ask Jim more questions after the talk too. And any questions you have about anything for me or Jim, Jim, if I get anything wrong, please feel free to correct me. But I am going to start recording on my, on my computer somehow. Oh, maybe I can't. All right, George, it's going to be up to you to make sure that this gets recorded. And
Val, I'm recording it to the cloud, so we can.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, let me pull up my.
And I'm gonna, yeah, right.
My presentation here. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to share with you tonight my typecasting adventures with Jim Walczak of Sycamore Press and Type Foundry, which is now located in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And just show you a little bit of what I've been doing up there with Jim and what I would like to do in the future. So, hi, I'm Val. I think I know pretty much everybody here. But if you don't know me or much about me, I started doing letterpress my very last semester when I was at the Maryland Institute College of Art. I took a course called Broadsides with Dolphin Press, which was Micah's special letterpress publishing arm of the printmaking department. And I really didn't know anything about it. I walked into their press room, saw all these little things, little tiny pieces of metal, these big presses, and I just got really excited. I knew this was something special. So while I was learning at Micah, I also took an internship down at Pyramid Atlantic, which was in Silver Spring at the time. And I met some really cool people there. So while I was interning, I met Chris Manson, Roland Hoover, and Mike Denker. They were kind of like the three musketeers that would come over to Pyramid and work on the presses and print with people. And they connected me with the rest of the Chesapeake chapter of the American Printing History Association. And you know, I walk in and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna get this big press. And I remember Roland being a little bit like, oh, are you sure? Do you know what you're getting into? But everybody was really supportive. And actually the photo on the left, that was my first press, was the Colts Armory. So with Roland and Chris and Mike and Steve Heaver's encouragement, I dragged this press home from a basement in Baltimore right after I graduated from college and got started collecting stuff and learning more about printing. And I just knew right off the bat that this was something really important and something really fun. So I've been learning since then, and I've been taking workshops in places. I've been working with other printers, learning from all the people in the chapter, learning how to fix presses with Paul Moxon, and just trying to get as wide experience in the letterpress printing process as possible. And that also included typecasting from pretty early on. I don't remember exactly when it was. It was probably in 2008 or 9 that Chris Manson took me down to meet Jim and Franziska in Oxon Hill. And I got to see Jim casting type that day in his beautiful shed, which is now the Airbnb. And it was really exciting to see this brand new type coming off of this big machine. At that point, I don't think I really knew how special that was, but I definitely know how important it is now. Unfortunately, I did not spend a whole lot of time down there with Jim while he was in the area. I was busy with trying to run my life and figure out what I'm doing. And Jim relocated to Williamstown at some point. I kept printing, I kept buying equipment, kept convincing people to help me move heavy things. And Jim and I kept in touch with yearly Christmas cards. He always does a really lovely printed card, and I just wanted to keep up with him. So we kept in touch. The pictures on the left are actually from my reintroduction to typecasting. So this was a week-long class at the Wells Book Art Center up in Aurora, New York. And I was lucky enough to be able to work with the Bixlers, Michael and Winnie. And at the bottom are two of my fellow classmates. We all got to learn how to use the supercaster and the composition caster. We actually used the keyboard process, which is encoding the text that you want the machine to cast for you on a tape. That tape goes into the caster, and then the machine just spits out your text ready to go. It was amazing. This is when I realized, like, I need to learn more about this. As a newer printer, you know, I'd seen everybody's beautiful shops with so much type. It's hard to find good type that's not worn down. And I wanted to be able to have access to new type and maybe stuff that wasn't available in other places or from, you know, somebody's basement. Having brand new type was something that would be really good for me to add to my shop so I could keep printing. So I emailed Jim and just kind of let him know that I was interested in learning some more, and he invited me up. So I planned a trip to Massachusetts in August of 2021. Oops. And I drove up. I had a couple buckets of type from my hell box. And while I was planning my trip, I realized that a few years earlier, my mom and I had driven up to North Adams with a van and picked up another Colts Armory press from an art center in town. And North Adams is just a couple of miles away from Williamstown. So I had been just around the corner from Jim and I didn't even realize it. If I'd known, I would have stopped in for a visit. So in August, I drove up to Massachusetts. It's about a 6-hour drive. I showed up and Jim's like, let's get ready, let's get casting. So fresh out of the car, jumped in front of the casters and kind of got everything set up. So this is a photo of Jim's shop here on the left. In the front is the composition caster. In the middle is the Sorts caster or the Orphan Annie. And at the far end is the Thompson caster. So I think right now the comp caster needs a little work, but the other two are working great. Each is good for doing a different type of casting. My main goal for this trip was to cast a big font of 12-point Kennerly so that I could work on some book projects that I'd had in mind for a while. So we would be doing that on the Sorts caster. So here's a close-up of the machine. You can see the pot of molten metal behind that copper feed table. Millions of moving parts, like so many intricate little parts in here. It's a gorgeous machine to look at, but it's just so complicated. This machine is the Lanston Monotype Sorts caster. It's from, I think, 1918. And it can use a couple different molds for the type. So the picture on the right is a 15 by 15 grid. That's the composition matrices in the matte case. So the machine can cast one of these at a time. And this machine can also use the flat display mats that are a little bit larger. So with this, we had our matte case of 12-point Kennerly. We had to write down the position of each letter that I needed to cast on that gridded sheet so that I could kind of dial in where that matte case needed to be in order to cast a particular letter. So we got everything set up and ready for the next day to actually start casting. Now casting on the Sorts caster is a process because every letter has to be aligned so that everything lines up perfectly when you print it. And the photo on the bottom right is a box of line standards. So this is going to give you something to align the baseline of your letter to, depending on the different typeface that you're casting. So on the left is a terrible microscope picture. But the line gauge and the piece of type are put in a special holder so that you can move it up and down and make sure that the baseline of the letter is in exactly the right position for the typeface that you're casting. So we would also have to adjust the width of the type So, you know, a lowercase I is very narrow, whereas W is very wide. So every letter needs to be adjusted to have the proper set width. So each time you change to a new letter, you have to do all this adjusting to make sure that everything is lining up just perfectly. Now, the composition caster will do all of that on its own because it has all these wedges that will adjust that for each letter as it's moving through your text. But the sorts caster is stripped down and you have to manually make all these adjustments. So I got very familiar with adjusting with a dial that moves something a 10,000th of an inch over to make sure that everything was perfectly aligned. And let's see if my videos will work. This is a video of setting up the piston in the pot of metal. So this is always a little scary.
Nice little lead fountain.
We have the molten metal that shoots up. That's actually the nozzle that the metal is forced out of and up into the mold. So by pushing the piston down and shooting the metal up out, you can tell that everything is flowing smoothly. And here's a quick video of some of the first sorts coming off of the machine. So I'll leave this running for a minute, but you can see down here is the pot of molten metal, and the mat case is held upside down in the bridge here. So the metal is forced up through the nozzle, through the mold, and into that little mold with the letter in it, and then they're pushed out the left side here. So all the little letters come marching out of the machine. Still very hot, they have to cool down a little bit. So once everything's set up, you just let it run for however many letters you need. So we cast enough type to fill the spaces in an empty type case so that I would have plenty of type to work with.
Excuse me, Val.
Yes.
Sorry to break in. I was just wondering, you had talked about dialing in the settings for your alignment and set width. I was just curious at this point if there's any, are they visible on this video at all, or?
Yeah, so these dials right here in the fronts, those are going to adjust the position of the mat case. And like each click you turn it moves it something crazy like 1/1000th of an inch to one side or the other. So
Okay.
one dial moves it back and forth and the other moves it left to right.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So we made good progress despite my little accident there on the left. That was my first squirt. So if something is not right in the machine and the mold is blocked, the machine can spit molten metal everywhere. Luckily, we're wearing big heavy aprons, so no one was injured at all, but I kept this as a souvenir. And this meant that I got to learn how to take apart the mat case and clean it. So what can happen is the metal gets forced in between the individual matrices and it can hold them apart and make things not work. So you have to clean all the little bits out and put it all back together. So good learning experience for me. It did set us back just a little bit, but we were making some progress getting this big font of typecast. So this is the progression. I took a picture at the end of every day so that I could see what we did, what we got done each day. So casting this font took us 6 days. We did take some breaks. We went on some hikes and talked about other printing things. And someone asked the alloy of the molten metal. So the alloy that we're using, we were using mostly old foundry type and melting it back down. And it's a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony. I don't know the exact proportions, but the foundry type is a harder mix, so it makes a stronger, harder type. to go back 1 second. So this full case on the end is probably about 80 pounds, and I have enough 12-point Kennerly to set my whole book and print it all at once, which is very exciting. Okay, so I think it was probably the second or third day that I was there. Jim asked if I wanted to work on something else and actually create my own design to cast type from. And of course I said yes. So I worked on a border design after dinner. We had gone on lots of hikes, and if you know me, you know that I am a bit of a mushroom nut. There was lots of mushrooms up in the woods in Vermont in August. So I had lots of pictures to work from up there. And I did a couple different iterations of this mushroom border. And of course, instead of starting with something simple, I decided to do a border design that had not only a corner piece, but a double width stretcher. So this would be an 18-point border. The stretcher piece is 18 by 36 points, and then the corner is just a square 18 points. So I had to make 2 different mats to cast this border correctly. The bottom right, you can see the polymer plates. For this process, I took my design, printed it out, and we hand washed polymer plates to make the pattern for the mats. And what we were using to make these mats is called a Price engraver. Unfortunately, I did not have a good picture of the whole machine, but you can see in the middle, it is a pantograph machine that has a tracer on one side and a cutting bit on the other. You can adjust the dimensions that it will reduce your pattern. So when you move the tracer 1 inch, the cutter might only move a ½ an inch. And it's going to reduce in size whatever pattern you're starting with and actually cut it into the brass mat that will go in the machine. So this was owned by Paul Hayden Dunsing previously, and he set it up for this purpose. So you can put a prepared piece of brass into the cutting side of the machine and actually engrave your mats that will be used as the mold for casting the type. So there was a lot of prep for this. We had to make sure that the design lined up with a standard 18-point mat so that the caster could cast it correctly. So on the left, you can see kind of the setup for figuring out where the design will go. And then that piece of brass is put into the special holder under the cutting bit, and it's ready to engrave. And this process requires cutters that have a tip about 3/1000 of an inch wide. So Jim has a special grinder that he used to actually make cutters. This was amazing to me. I thought that that would be something you'd have to buy. But Jim just set up this little machine and made a 4-pointed cutting tool. And we got them as fine as possible. So we were aiming for 3/1000 of an inch at the tip of the cutter. That goes in the machine. And to engrave this takes several passes. So you do a shallow pass, another pass, then you sharpen the bit and do a final pass to get your final designs, your final details in the type. So you can see both of the mushroom pieces in the left or the right-hand pictures here. That's still set up in the machine and they're ready to be finished. And here is a time-lapse video. So my hand up at the top right is moving the tracer inside that polymer pattern that we made. And then the cutting bit on the left is actually reducing that in size and cutting that design right into the brass mat. And this was just fascinating. I fell in love with this instantly. And Ray asked if I was tracing around the polymer plate. So the polymer plate is actually reverse of what you would use for printing. So the design is sunk down into the plate and that holds the tracer in that area as you're cutting it out. And the bottom of it, like what will be the face of the type, is the deepest part of the mold. That takes the last pass to polish it with a really fine bit. I did have some trouble with it breaking on my last pass, and I had to make it just a hair deeper and polish that surface again. So that final surface, that final pass has to be as smooth as possible so that you get a good face on your type. And I think that's something that I definitely could use some more practice on. So these are the final mats for my mushroom border. Once they were finished being engraved, you polish the surface and even sand it down a little bit to make sure that the depth of the actual design is 50 thousandths of an inch, because that's what the casting machine is set up for. So that is the depth of the type above the shoulder. And if you make that exactly 50 thousandths of an inch when you cast your type, it should be exactly type high. So these were sanded down and polished. We set these up for the Thompson, so the corners are not beveled. For the Monotype caster, later we would end up beveling the edges so they fit in the sorts caster. But for the Thompson, these fit right in the mat holder. So this is the Thompson. We set this up, I think, the day before I was supposed to leave. And this machine's a little more scary because the pot of molten metal is right here. It's about a little under chest high, and it shoots the metal straight towards you. So if you don't have a mat in here, it sounds like it would be very possible to just shoot metal towards yourself. So this one was a little more intimidating to me. You can see there's a plexiglass shield here to protect the caster from any mishaps that might happen. And in the middle picture, you can see we're actually testing that nozzle. There's a little bit of molten metal coming out into the ladle. So we're making sure that that nozzle is clear for the metal to move through the machine. And on the right is my mat that I engraved in that holder. So the holder goes into the machine against the mold, and then the metal is pushed through against that engraving.
Can you see in there, through there?
So the Thompson, it can cast larger type. I believe it's up to 48 points, and it's going to run a lot slower than the Monotype machine or the sorts caster did. So especially when you're casting a larger piece of type, it's going to take longer to cast each sort because the metal has to solidify and then be pushed out. So it's going to take a little bit longer to do each one. And while we were running this, the machine was working fine, but we noticed some problems. This machine, the pieces of type come out pushed very closely together. So the edges of my border that hung over the sides got pushed together and pushed up, and this kind of messed up the face of them a little bit. So not perfect, but for my first try at engraving this and Jim helping to cast it, I was pretty pleased with this. Having just a few days earlier had the basic idea for this, refined it over a few days, and then engraved and cast type. I mean, where else can you do that? Ray asked how much longer for larger type. It really depends on the temperature of the metal and how big the type is, but you'll see in the video how slowly the machine's turning over compared to how fast the sorts caster was running.
Yeah, cool.
So here's a video of the Thompson. Jim did all the machine wrangling on this one.
I should have given her my video.
So every time this wheel goes around, it's making one piece of type. And it will pause and let the type kind of solidify, and then it will push it out. So more than a couple seconds per piece of type for this.
Oh no, what's that?
Oh, it's YouTube. So we cast up a lot of mushrooms, the border pieces, the corner and the stretcher both, and I had intentions of selling those, but once I got home, I really realized that since the caster pushed them together, the edges got pushed up, and when you printed that, it meant that that little corner was too high and it really punched in the paper. So they also didn't quite line up because I must have engraved my mat just a little bit crooked. So I now know the importance of making sure everything is perfectly square and you're casting it on the right caster for the design. So I set up a few tests with these. I'm really happy with the way that this turned out design-wise. I think it has a nice weight to it. And I like that the border pieces can be combined on their own to create these little mushroom flowers. So kind of right from the start of getting home and working with this, I realized that I wanted to make this perfect, and that would mean recasting it someday. But I was just super happy to have had this experience, and if this was all that happened, I would have still been thrilled. So in October of last year, I went to visit Rich Hopkins out in West Virginia. So I'm in the process of just trying to learn as much as possible from all the people around here. And luckily there's a lot of typecasters on the East Coast, amazingly. So Rich had put a notice in the APA bundle that he would be recasting Sapphire, which is this beautiful 36-point ornamented face designed by Herman Zapp. So I emailed him and said, hey, do you want help with that? Can I come help you? So he said, yeah. And I drove out to West Virginia, and over 4 days, we cast about 44 fonts of this beautiful face. Had a lot of troubleshooting to do. So we were using the Supercaster, which is an English machine, and it can cast much larger type, I think at least up to 72 points. So this can do a much larger piece of type. It's another great machine. I love it. But we had a lot of work to do to get the metal at the right temperature and to get the piston working properly. So there's a lot of taking things apart and cleaning them and putting them back together to get the type to be nice and solid. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. Since you're forcing metal into this little tiny area, the air has to go somewhere. And if you don't force the air out enough, you end up with type that is 50% air. So it looks like Swiss cheese if you cut it open. So we did a lot of troubleshooting to make sure that the type was nice and solid. So much to learn. Every time I go visit someone and talk to someone about this, I'm just learning how much more there is to learn about this whole process here. But Rich's collection is amazing. He has a really impressive collection of historical mats, really, really old mats, and typefaces that no one else has access to. So it was really great to reconnect with him as well. And that made me eager to get back up to Massachusetts. So over the winter break, a friend had asked me if any of the casters I knew had snowflake designs. She was looking for snowflakes to print some cards with. And I emailed Jim, we looked through the Monotype book, and there really were no designs that were true 6-pointed snowflakes. And being a nature person, an 8-pointed snowflake just rubs me the wrong way. So I decided to draw up a design from photos of actual snowflakes that I'd taken. I sent a sketch of that up to Jim, and he emailed me a week later and said, oh, here you go, here's some tests. He'd already engraved a mat and cast some snowflake tests, and that was really exciting. So I made plans to visit in January and recast the mushrooms and also make a set of snowflake type. So we decided to do 3 different sizes of the snowflakes, an 18, 24, and 36 points, so that people could really play around with them and make some interesting compositions for cards. So the same design originally was going to be used for all 3 sizes. When I arrived in Massachusetts, we set up the mushroom border first to get that kind of out of the way. We decided to cast this on the sorts caster this time so that the ends of the mushrooms didn't get pushed up, and it made a much better piece of type with those overhanging ends. Now, one thing about the overhanging ends, they all have to be filed down. So every single piece of type in this border, I had to rub the sides of it to get those little overhanging edges off so that the mushrooms butt up right against each other for the border. So we cast, I think, about 15 sets of this mushroom border. I filed down every single piece and then put them together in fonts that are a nice size to make a border with. Shorman asked how many impressions you can get with the cast type. This is a mix of foundry type and other metals. So if you're careful with it and you print with a KISS impression, you could get thousands of impressions out of this. So it's delicate, but as long as you're not smashing it into the paper and you're printing with a kiss impression, this type should last a long time. We cut some open, they're really nice and solid inside. So they're a good solid piece of type.
Indeed. Next.
All right, so this is a close-up video of the mushroom borders. And if you watch right in the middle, you'll see that new sort kind of popping up out of the mold, and then they all get pushed out of the machine. So here's the new sort, and when the mold comes up, you can see the new piece is right about here in the middle, and then the little type pusher reaches in and grabs it and pulls it out of the machine. So there's all these little pieces that come together to pull your type out of the machine.
What the heck is that?
It's YouTube. It's trying to make you watch other stuff, sorry. So here is another video. So again, this is the sorts caster casting the 18-point snowflakes. You can see it's running pretty fast. Since it's a smallish to medium-sized type, the machine can run pretty quickly with this. And I just love watching these machines. It's got such a good rhythm to it. It's just fascinating to see all the parts moving at different times and all lining up to do what you want it to do. So we worked on the snowflakes since they were 18-point. We cast the mushrooms first and then put the snowflake mat in since it's the same size. And Jim had that mat ready to go when I arrived. The photo in the middle is the display mat holder for the sorts caster. So the flat mat has to have beveled edges so that it fits in this holder. And then this goes into the sorts casting machine. And after running some tests, we decided that the 18-point snowflake looked good with my original design, but the 24 and 36 needed a little bit more detail. So we re-engraved mats for those larger sizes with a little different design. And here you can see the blue picture is the polymer plate being exposed. Jim has a little portable exposure unit with the UV light that hardens the polymer plate. The second picture is that pattern with the tracer. So the little tip is the tracer that goes inside that recessed area in the polymer plate to move the drill bit as you're moving it. The third picture is engraving in progress. So I had just started to kind of flatten out the whole area of the snowflake. So this has a shoulder in it. You don't engrave the entire design all the way down. You have a wider area to support the finer details. So the first pass has no detail. It's just the outside shape of the snowflake. And at that point, the tip had broken on my cutter. So I had to go sharpen a new cutter and replace it. And the final picture is the finished 36-point snowflake mat. So we attempted to cast both of these larger pieces of type on the sorts caster. The 24-point took a while to get it to work. You can see on the left, there's a little molten snowflake there. Since this is a larger piece of type, we had to adjust the speed of the caster. What was happening, I think, was the metal was still molten when the mat moved back up, and it sucked the molten type or the molten metal out of the piece of type in the middle and made this little explosion. So with some adjustments and making sure the machine was happy, we got the 24-point to run on the sorts caster really well. But the 36-point, we just couldn't get it to work. The type was really hollow inside. When we cut it open, it was like Swiss cheese. And the 36-point quad is the biggest piece of type that that machine can make. And it did not want to make it. So we decided to move the 36-point to the Thompson. So we put the mat in the Thompson, start casting, and right away we were having some issues. The middle picture, you can see there are these little fins of metal on the pieces of type. And that meant that somewhere inside the machine, there was metal keeping something from working correctly. So we had to tear down this whole part of the mold, clean everything out. We actually found metal that was in one of the oil holes blocking it. So we cleaned everything out, put it back together, and it was time for dinner. But the machine was happy and ready to go the next day. And here's a video of the snowflakes coming off of the Thompson caster. Oh, I'm sorry, this is actually the mushrooms, but you can see the speed of the Thompson and how the pieces come out onto the stick. So a lot slower than the Swords caster.
Okay.
So once we got the machine all cleaned up, it was perfectly happy to cast as many 36-point snowflakes as we wanted. So we cast up a whole blizzard of snowflakes.
Blizzard, very good.
And throughout the week, I had been posting on social media some process pictures, and I had people emailing me already interested in buying some sets. So we cast enough that I could make nice little fonts to sell to people and share these designs with other printers. And you can see on the far right, that is the snowflake font. So you got 3 different sizes in 2 different designs of those snowflakes. And once I got home, I printed up some nice specimen sheets and immediately sold all of the sets of type that we had cast. So there are lots of printers out there now that have the mushroom border and the snowflakes. I'm really happy to have been able to make these new designs that people can use in their own work. People have been sharing some photos of what they've been printing with them, and that's really exciting. Next winter, I expect to see a lot of holiday cards with some snowflakes on them. But I would love to be able to offer more designs that are my own images that I've come up with. There are a lot of historical designs that I'm interested in kind of recreating and recasting that you might not be able to get anywhere else. And I'm really lucky to have had the chance to work with Jim and learn all this stuff, because there's no one else who could have taught me all this and taught me how to use the engraving machine. I don't think there's really anyone else who has all of this equipment available who's so willing to teach someone, so that all of this stuff stays alive for another 100 years, hopefully. So my goal is to keep learning more, really learn how these machines work and how to take care of them, and to create some new designs and be able to offer new type for printers for a long time. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, Jim. I'm really proud to be able to learn this from you and to kind of keep this tradition going. So that's what I've been doing with typecasting. I'm actually hoping to go back up to Jim's in a couple of weeks and recast more mushrooms and hopefully work on a new design. So if anyone is interested in ordering either a mushroom border or a snowflakes, you can let me know and I will make sure to cast enough. But that is the end of my talk. So if anyone has any questions that I missed or new questions, just let me know. And Jim, if I got anything wrong, please correct me.
You did fine, Val. I dubbed the itinerant type founder supreme or whatever. Thank you for a nice presentation.
Thank you so much, Val. The obvious question, I think, is, so when are you getting a caster?
Well, I need some more space first. My shop is maxed out right now, so I am actually looking into building a garage or some sort of addition so that I can eventually get some casting equipment.
And remember that later you can always turn it into a B&B if you need, you know.
Yes, that's right.
Did we get all the questions in the chat? I was curious, Val, how long did it take to clean up the squirt? That's got to take a minute.
The first one didn't take too long. It was really just kind of sitting on the surface. So we just had to take the mat holder out and kind of pry it off. The second one, I had to take it apart. Taking apart the case enough to clean around all the pieces that the lead was stuck around probably took about half an hour to 45 minutes. But I didn't have to take everything out, just some rows to access where there was metal interfering with the matrices. So it could have been worse.
Yeah, actually, that to me, that sounds like pretty quick. I'm sure when you're doing it, it doesn't feel that way, but
Yeah, whenever anything goes wrong, it's like, oh, I have to stop working and fix this thing, but you really can't continue without fixing what's wrong. The Thompson, when we realized that we had to take it apart, you know, Jim mentioned that it had been kind of acting up and it just kept getting worse, and eventually it shot metal straight at the ceiling, and we were like, oh, that's it, we got to take this apart and fix it.
the question about how long, Jim, do you have any guess? Val, when the question came up about how long does type last, you mentioned thousands. For the work that a lot of us do, a run of a couple hundred is a lot. But I'm thinking back in the day, I mean, you'd have runs that would be 10,000. Jim, do you have any estimate how many impressions you could get out of like Monotype?
Well, there's Monotype, and what we're doing, we're using Monotype machines, but we're using pretty darn hard metal.
Yeah.
And some people used to say, well, you're going to ruin your machine, but I don't think there's too much truth to that. But where were we? Oh, it depends on the pressman. Of course, you can't use soft packing and smash it into paper to get a, what do you call it, sock. If you under good hands, you can print tens of thousands, I'm sure.
Right.
With what we're making. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds, if I remember correctly, I think Foundry Type has a little bit of copper in it to harden it up some.
There used to be Type Foundry saying we have copper type or something like that. I remember, but one
There
foundry
is.
did that. I don't remember who it was.
I guess there is actually copper and brass type, but I think that's used mostly for bookbinding.
Standard. Yeah.
But
Nothing to do with printing type, no.
Yeah, I think going way back, I think it was a little bit of copper that makes Foundry Type a little harder than the other.
I'm not sure if that's true, but it's okay to believe it.
Yeah.
I saw in the chat that someone asked the material of the cutter. I think it's a hardened steel rod like you would use for a drill bit. Is that right, Jim? It's hardened steel
Yeah,
for
it's
the cutters?
drill rod. It's called 1/8" diameter drill rod, and you can't cut it. So when you need a piece of it, you put it in a vise and hit it with a hammer and break it off. And then
So when we're making the cutters, we had to be careful not to let it heat up too much, so it didn't ruin the temper.
Let's see. I want to say something here about this young man, Stuart Bradley, and he's the lower end of my screen. Stuart was instrumental in getting me started on this stuff. When I brought the engraving machine home from Paul Dunsing's house in Georgia. He lived in Georgia. I set it up, and it just Bradley Stuart lived across the river from me, and he often stopped in for a visit. And he came by, and I showed him how it works. Made a couple little mats from patterns I happened to have, and then Stuart helped me through my first big job. That was the ink ball, the German ink ball stock design. And some of you may have seen it. It's sprouting branches. It's kind of, a tongue-in-cheek type thing. And but Stuart, he gave me the idea to, yeah, there it is. He gave me the idea to do that, and got me started. I was surprised. It was a very ambitious project to do, and it worked out fine, as you just showed us. So thanks, Stuart.
Yeah, let me just say, you gave me the first casting of that, and I have it on my shelf and it says 2006. It's hard to believe it's been that long
Yeah.
since
that's
we
been
did
a
that,
while.
but I have to give credit to Mike Anderson. He's the one that taught me how to do-it-yourself photopolymer.
Yeah. And thanks to Mike and you, and we have this system that Val has jumped into. Thank you. Thank you.
Good to see
I
you,
think
Jim.
we actually found the notes from Mike Anderson and some notes from you, Stuart, about working with the homemade polymer exposing unit. So yes, thank you very much for sure.
We'll put a
Yeah,
line
'cause-
in that little, it's called a contact printer. It's a piece of glass and a hinge frame, you know. Some of you are maybe old enough to have done that in the old days, making photographs. But Anderson, I believe, is responsible for coming up with the idea to buy a kitchen ultraviolet under-counter lamp and mount a pair of them on top of this frame and expose the photopolymer. It hardens it, I mean. So when you wash it, you wash away the unhardened part. And in the case of making a pattern, as you saw, we wash away the image so the follower can follow the image. But if you're making a cut or to print from, you just in the computer reverse the make a negative instead of a positive, and then you end up with the design is high and will take ink and print. So that's enough on that.
Ray asked about the polymer being too soft. We were using the metal backed polymer, so the tracer bit is actually down almost against the metal. We took a trip to see Ed at Swamp Press, and he uses the Benton engraver to make his mats. And I think he was talking about the shoulder of the inside of the pattern can affect that. So you have to make sure that your tracer is the right size for your cutting bit. But the metal backed polymer seemed to work really well. It wasn't like squishy against the tracer. And one thing I want to add is that I'm documenting everything in this process. So that's something that I'm going to continue next time I go up to Jim's, is just making sure that there's a really good documentation of all the steps for engraving a new mat, so that not only I can do it later, but other people could learn how to do it too with this process. So just making sure that this knowledge is all like really carefully written down and shared with whoever might be interested in it.
Very good. Any more questions out there?
I have a very simple question, and it's just I mean, I've been with Stan in his studio when he was casting, but he was just kind of like experimenting and trying stuff out. But in the shop while the casters are working, are they super noisy and clanky, or is it kind of a rhythmic, kind of syncopated thing? I'm not sure.
Mostly the latter. You have a lot of time watching it and you start hearing things. It's like a printing press does the same thing. They talk to you. And I think you all have heard things. It's amazing. But the typecaster comes up with some very good statement, whatever you call, songs and things. So I like to look at it that way.
Yeah, I loved working on the composition caster at the Bixlers, because as it would change to a different letter, it would make a different sound. So it would be like this little dance that it made. But it's pretty loud. There's a lot of clanking. But when I was working with Rich, he was, listening really carefully, and he could tell when a piece of type was bad just from the sound that it made while it was being cast. So I think if you've been doing this for long enough, you tune your ear to all those different sounds. But it is pretty cool just having all the clanking and at the different speeds and everything. It's like a little symphony.
Okay. Everybody's quiet. How about all the ladies in this thing here? Any questions to that? At
I have
least
a,
wait
I have a
minute.
question, Jim. Where are you right now?
Well, I'm in Williamstown in my daughter's house in her workshop.
So she's an artist.
Yeah, she has like an art studio here,
Yeah.
essentially a made-over garage, etc. And
If you notice in the background, there is a life-size sculpture of Michael Jackson.
yeah, right over my shoulder. I can't do it. Right there. She made that Michael Jackson. It was turned into a huge statue. No, later it was. I have to get her to talk about it, but we don't want to. Let me see. Diana,
Yeah.
they're asking about Michael Jackson, not, how about a real short story?
Oh,
You want to come in here?
Very creative family, the
Here's-
Walzak.
Here's the artist. Where's the camera? Here.
hi.
There she is. Come down a little. Okay. Real short story on Michael Jackson. Because it's a long story, but she was
Well,
just
there
curious.
is a YouTube video you can
Get
watch.
in
It's 5
closer.
minutes.
Okay.
I don't know if we can show it, but it's like, it's called Making History. And if you search for Diana Walzak and Making History, you should be able to find it. So that's a 5-minute video. I mean, basically, my husband, Jeff, and I were doing like experimental work, creating synthetic characters, really the very, very beginning. Like we were doing it the hardest possible way back in the mid 80s. And we were very social and we had parties at our house under the Hollywood sign, which was built in the 60s by a band, the Association, or one of the guys. No, it wasn't built by him, but one of the Association people lived in it, and it's in Linda McCartney's book and stuff like that. So anyway, it was a very inspirational place to be, like kind of in LA, but kind of above it all with the birds and, you know, the clouds and everything. And we made I made like tons of faces out of clay. And
Hi, Don.
there was this guy who made album covers for Michael Jackson at Sony. He was one of the people that came to our social events. And like years later, like 5 years later, he called me. We had already like left LA, came to the Berkshires to work with Doug Trumbull on some big projects. So it was 5 or 6 years later, got a call from him, and he said, hey, Michael's making a new album. He wants to be this giant statue, like the one he saw in Russia, which is the Mamayev Kurgan, by the way. And he had the idea. He said, I saw what you guys were doing with the, you know, trying to make these synthetic people back in the 80s. Can you make a virtual statue that Michael could, you know, change the angle, change the lighting, stuff like that? Of course, you guys all know that's commonly done now, but it was sort of a novel idea then, because Michael was known for like changing something after it was already created. So they'd hire an artist for a lot of money, and then Michael would say, oh, can we change it around? And then they have to pay again. So they were trying to avoid this, like having to do this statue idea over and over. So they were, so I said, yeah, we can do that. And so we did. It was basically, I specified a photo shoot in New York, so that we could get large blow-ups that could be measured, so I could work really quickly. I had basically 1 week in which to sculpt that piece. The thing behind you is a direct cast from the original. So it was pretty big, you know, to work that fast. I did have 2 assistants as part of the budget, which made it go a lot faster. They helped with the armature and making all the little parts that metallic pieces and stuff like that. So I could focus on the face and give it a monumental look. So anyway, it eventually got copied for a huge campaign in 1995. I learned later, years later, as a matter of fact, not that long ago, that there were 70 artists that were trying to win the design for this. But I had at the time that we were hired, I didn't know about any of that. So, which was probably good. You know, I just went into it and it was a fun thing to do. It was an incredible experience. And in a way, it's not over. People ask me about it all the time. So I just did an interview with some French guys 2 days ago for a vlog, which interview type thing over Zoom. So
He's an expert.
so anyway, you can look at that making history thing. It's 5 minutes. And then there's some old footage that you might see that also a little longer, like more footage of me sculpting. But this making history one kind of tells the story. And it has an interesting little twist to it, because in 2014, somebody found this handwritten note by Michael that was requesting a 5 times life size, so like a 30-foot bronze of this particular statue. So when I heard that, I said, wow, you know, that's a testimonial for making an actual good quality bronze big statue. Michael would like that. So maybe it'll happen one of these days. So that is in the making history, because nowadays you can make really beautiful big enlargements of a smaller statue. But back then they did it without consulting me. They made like 12 of these kind of, I don't know, 20 or 30-foot things, floated one down the Thames River and Cairo and South Africa, and you know, they put them up everywhere, but they're kind of monstrosities. They look at first glance like this, but a lot of the fans tell me that they look closely and they say that's not Michael. So it'd be nice one day.
Diana, could you send me a link to that and I can share it with everyone in our newsletter?
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
So obviously creativity runs in the Walzecs.
Yeah, so a quick question for Diana. Did you work with your dad in the shop, or did you learn kind of printmaking and?
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, I was in the basement almost all the time. I did get a lot from my mom too. Upstairs was sewing, music making, and cooking. And then downstairs was painting and drawing and printing. And I wasn't typecasting, but doing a lot of printing and leather work. I made a pair of shoes once. What else we did? Metal, everything.
Yeah,
you know, like,
woodworking was big, and
Yeah.
photography.
yeah. So like when people ask me where did it start, I usually say in my dad's shops.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yes,
We taught her well.
absolutely.
That's great.
I gravitated also to, you know, they weren't like forcing it on me. So
Okay. I think
That's great. It's
probably